Welcome back to That Dad Guy. Today we are doing something, a little bit of a mixture of two things together. First, last week I received this envelope from Sam in Illinois, and in it not only was there a postcard, but there was an envelope marked stamps. So I want to show you those stamps. The second thing we have is a new issued Canada Post stamp, and it is about the Rcmp, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. So I want to talk a little bit about that too. First, I'm going to start with what Sam sent, wrap that all up. Then I'm going to show you the new issued stamp. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the history of the Rcmp. Hopefully you're good with that. If you want to learn something maybe a little new, and maybe there's stuff that I didn't touch on that you want to talk about, you can leave it in the comments. And after you're done, if you like it, subscribe. If you're not already subscribed, leave me a comment. Like it, share it with your friends, do all that sort of stuff. But thanks so much for tuning in this time and checking me out. It's a little bit of a mixture what Sam sent. They're countries from around the world. Some of them are on the backing of paper and some of them aren't. This is an airmail from the United States. There's another airmail. It's a Statue of Liberty there. Babe Ruth, famous New York Yankee. Big slugger, big pitcher. American one. And then we're moving into Singapore. Just for one stamp. Nice image there of Queen Elizabeth II as well. Stamp from Colombia. And another from Colombia. Here we have an Irish stamp. Very fascinating image on it. One from Malta with the Queen. Appreciate the ones with the Queen so much more now that she has passed on. And to see how she's changed in the images. Czechoslovakia. So a little bit older stamp. Another one from Czechoslovakia. And one from India. Sorry for the glare on it. I'll try to change the angle a little bit to divert the light. One from Nigeria. Cattle ranching. There's a mint one of the United Nations. Always appreciate a good UN stamp. One from Australia. The Australian Arctic Territory. Or Antarctic Territory, excuse me, not Arctic Territory, in the south. One from Japan. One from Korea. And that is the lot of stamps that Sam sent. So thank you so much, Sam, for those collection of stamps. I'm going to find a place for them. And like you said, if they don't belong in my collection, then maybe they will belong in someone else's collection too. If they happen to be duplicates of things that my father had collected too, they might go in that. You can see I've got a bunch of stamps that have been soaked off. I'm going to do a second spraying of those because they're still a bit sticky on the back. So I want to clear up the gumminess of them. Those are some Canadian stamps, so I want to send those back off into the world too for people that maybe haven't started collecting Canadian stamps and want to start a collection of Canadian. I love to encourage that. As a member of Canada Post, I want to continue using Canadian stamps and having people collect them, so that's great. Speaking of Canadian stamps, that's going to be my segue into the newest released Canadian stamp, which is the Rcmp's 150th anniversary. There is the traditional red uniform that most people associate with an Rcmp officer. And here is the stamp showing, a different look of what a Rcmp officer may look like. On the back it says, in 2023, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Rcmp, marked its 150th anniversary. Established as the Northwest Mounted Police and an Act of Parliament on May 23, 1873, the Rcmp has evolved into an internationally recognized police organization. It operates from coast to coast to coast and beyond Canada's borders through international policing and peacekeeping efforts. The Rcmp is Canada's national police force and is present from the community level to the provincial, the territorial, and the federal levels. I think it's a pretty nice looking stamp, very colorful. Shows you different aspects of being an Rcmp officer, not just being on a horse, but behind a desk and a computer. We have RCMP officers out in the field as well. On the front, you can see the fingerprint, representing some of the detective work that needs to be done by an RCMP officer as well. So I want to go from that stamp issue to give you a bit of history of the RCMP, the good, the bad, not full details, but an overview of what the RCMP is all about, how they came to be, what their purpose was then, what their purpose is now, and hopefully educates you a little bit. It certainly educates me whenever I can go in and do some research on some of these topics. Sometimes we take things that we think we know for granted until we go in and find some of the other details. So where did the RCMP come from? In that little brief thing I told you, it says they were first established as the Northwest Mounted Police in 1873. But why? So in 1867, the Dominion of Canada was created. That's when we became a nation. And in 1868, we had the Dominion Police Force created. So that was our federal police force at the time. And it ran until 1920. And we'll tell you what happened in 1920 with the Dominion Police Force. But in 1870, our then Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, who was the first Prime Minister of Canada, thought about creating a kind of a paramilitary police force that could maintain law in this new region that we had, the Northwest Territories. So in 1870, Canada, I'm going to throw up a map of what we looked like in 1870, very different than what we look like now. You kind of had the Atlantic provinces, New Brunswick and Nova Scotia down here, and you had Quebec, which was kind of a sliver, and then Ontario, which was another sliver of land. Then you had this little postage stamp of Manitoba, and then you had British Columbia way out on the west coast, and then everything else was once called Rupert's Land. It was owned by the Hudson's Bay Company, and in 1870, the Dominion of Canada bought it, called it the Northwest Territories, and it was pretty much, it was lots of open land, lots of indigenous people in that area, and not a lot of settlers in that area. So John A. Macdonald was fearful that American traders that were crossing the border and going into that area and trading with the native people might just decide, we like this, we want what's here, and annex it for themselves. So he wanted to create this cavalry, riflemen, mounted police that could go out and protect that border. Originally, he was thinking 200 men probably would do it, but it is a massive territory. Eventually, in 1873, when it was established, they decided to go with 550 men to start, and they made the trek west. That wasn't an easy trek, 900 miles, and along the way, they lost horses, they got lost, they thought they were in an area, a fort that they were going to, they weren't there, horses started to die because they weren't getting enough food and water and all the rest of it, but eventually they got themselves established, and they started establishing forts and outposts along the way, and setting up routine routes that they could go in and travel. But the whiskey trade was something that they really had to monitor. They were afraid of American traders coming up and natives getting into clashes, so they made sure that they were in there protecting the interests. The native people at the time really saw the RCMP as their own protectorates. A lot of times when there was clashes with white settlers or white traders, the RCMP really held stronger to protecting the native rights. That wasn't the case continually after that, unfortunately, but in the early going, that's what they did. The other thing they were trying to do, I mean, they had these red coats. They looked like the military because they were based off of the British Army and the Canadian military, so they had that military look to them. Excuse me. But these patrols patrolled over 1,400 kilometers of territory, and every once in a while they thought, okay, maybe everything is done. They've done what they needed to do, and maybe the RCMP or the Northwest Mounted Police need to be disbanded, but something new would come along. We had the Sioux Indians came across from the U.S. that were trying to escape from the U.S. military, and they crossed over the border into Canada, and they fought with our native established groups that we had here, the Blackfoot. So the Sioux and then the Blackfoot clashed. There was 5,600 Sioux that crossed the border, and the Northwest Mounted Police eventually pushed them back and got them back into the United States. So that was another way that they were protecting our native rights, but also protecting that strong border that they didn't want to eventually cross over and have the U.S. try to annex our territory. The Klondike Gold Rush took place, and so the Northwest Mounted Police were there for that too, and they helped protect settlers and their claims along the way. In 1885, though, we had the Red River Rebellion in Manitoba. The Métis people and Louis Riel and some of the native groups started an uprising, and the Mounties were asked to come in again and stop that. Other soldiers were trekked in on the train, which the Rcmp were instrumental in protecting the train when it went through and had strikes. Some of the Rcmp actually became conductors and protected the rail lines and the rail cars during those strikes. But they came in for the Red River Rebellion and helped push that off and break it up. It took a little while to do it, but they were instrumental in that. And then when Canada wanted to continue to try to colonize those western provinces, what became Alberta and Saskatchewan, the Rcmp's role, or not the Rcmp, the Northwest Mounted Police's role changed. It was more, rather than protecting the Indians, they were trying to protect the colonists from the Aboriginal people. I say Indians, but that's what they were called at the time. We call them Aboriginal people now. So if I say Indians every once in a while, that's just because of the notes that I've taken. Those Aboriginal people, they wanted them to stay where they were and show that they could be protected away. That Red River Rebellion really changed the government in Ottawa's mind at the time of what side the native people might be on if there was a clash. So they had almost an apartheid-like way of treating the native people, keeping them on reserves, giving them passes that they had to follow, that if they had this pass to get off the reserve, they had to be back by a certain time. And it was all trying to protect Western colonization, which was happening at the time, the Western expansion. So that's where the Northwest Mounted Police changed from being protectorates of the Aboriginal people to almost being enslavers. And we can get into talking about, or we could have get into talking about the school systems and how Rcmp, not the Rcmp, well, later it became the Northwest Mounted Police at the time, took children out of people's homes and tried to put them into this educational program, and that happened for a long time. That did happen, and the police force was used for it, but we won't get into any more of that. It did happen. There's bad things that happen along the way. I'm trying to highlight some of the good and some of the bad. But during that expansion, the Northwest Mounted Police became instrumental in protecting the trains, protecting colonizers that were coming across, settlers that were trying to establish farms along the way. They had to stop horse thieving, which was a big thing. The native people would come in and steal the horses that were there. All because they didn't want all these people on their land that was being stolen from them. So it was justifiable in why they were trying to stop it. But Canada was expanding, and the European wave that was coming across of settlers that were moving here was fast and furious. As things settled down, the Northwest Mounted Police became instrumental in the Boer War, the Second Boer War, which took place in South Africa. At the end of the century, we sent a detachment of mounted cavalry from the Northwest Mounted Police there, and in response, I get it here, King Edward VII gave the title of Royal to the group for their help during the war. And so instead of it being the Northwest Mounted Police, it became the Royal Northwest Mounted Police since in 1904. And troops went on to the First World War and helped out in that as well. And then in 1920, they merged the Dominion Police Force, which we said was already established in 1868. And in 1920, they took the Royal Northwest Mounted Police and the Dominion Police Force and put them together and created the Rcmp. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police was established at that point in time. So that is a quick history of some of the things that you're going to see through the Rcmp. One of the other, back in 1919, there was a rebellion in Manitoba that happened. So First World War had finished, and then there was an uprising that started. Canada, that was just before the Rcmp was created, and they were thinking about, well, we're going to get rid of the Northwest Mounted Police. We don't really need them anymore. Canada's kind of an established country now. We have our Dominion Police Force. And then they started thinking about Russia. What would Russia's influence be on Canada if the Bolsheviks came here and started creating strikes and union strife and all sorts of things happening? So they thought, well, we probably should keep the Northwest Mounted Police on for that, to protect against the Bolsheviks. And in 1919 in Manitoba and Winnipeg, there was a strike uprising. And the Royal Northwest Mounted Police went in, and they call it Bloody Saturday, which seems strange that it's called Bloody Saturday because one person was killed and several were injured. Only one person died in the uprising. The uprising disbanded after the Northwest Mounted Police, Royal Northwest Mounted Police, fired into the crowd and killing one person and injuring others. That was our Bloody Saturday. And that was the catalyst for creating the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in 1920, 1 year later. And from there, they went on to become icons. You can see images of how they've changed, or they're not on horses anymore. You can see they used to be in their red uniforms and that, but we've gone to cars. They're kind of in blue. They've got flak jackets on now if they need it. They've got modern weapons and modern technology to protect them. We do have what's called the musical ride. I'll show a picture of that. You can see we have this group of 34 Mounties that still go on horses and do intricate riding patterns. They travel all around the world showing off their equestrian capabilities, which is outside of what the Royal Canadian Mounted Police does within Canada, because they're still a police force. They are represented in communities that don't have their own police forces or provincial territory. So like in Ontario and Quebec, they have the Ontario Provincial Police and the Quebec Provincial Police, but the Rcmp still have detachments in those to protect federal laws and do things. So not only they're a municipal police force, but they are provincial police forces in some areas and in the territories, and they're still doing, they have a military service and peacekeeping around the world. They're very strong, were strong supported by Queen Elizabeth II. You can see there's an image of her here at the start, the procession of her funeral. Horses that were donated to her from the Rcmp led the procession. They were also leading the procession for King Charles III's coronation, so they're very strong attachment to the monarchy. They've also been represented in many TV shows and movies. I put up a few posters here. You've got Brendan Fraser in Dudley Do Right as a Mountie. You've got the show Due South, which was a Rcmp officer that went down to Chicago and worked alongside an American police officer, and kind of the Canadian stereotypes to the American stereotypes and how they worked together on that. You had the farcical comedy Canadian Bacon with John Candy. Stephen Wright played a buffoon of a Mountie when the Americans decided they were going to invade Canada and take over Canada's capital, which they thought was Toronto at the time in the movie. So Rcmp officers have been depicted in many different ways in TV and movies over time. But what I want to say is that it is an image that has good memories and stands strong for Canada when they think of Canadian police, even though there is a varied history of how the government has used them over time. and I won't take it out on the police force for what has happened over time. But in anything that takes place in history, there are going to be ups and downs towards it. But they're still represented well. In 1975, the Canadian $50 bill, I'll throw a picture of that up, has a picture of the musical ride and the Rcmp on the back of it. That bill has long been replaced by other things since, but growing up, if I was lucky enough to see a $50 bill, that was the image I got to see on the back. That's what I want to say. There is a quick history of the Rcmp from their inception in 1873 with the Northwest Mounted Police, the 1904 the Royal Northwest Mounted Police, to 1920 when they became the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and where we are now. And many communities are lucky to have them. Here in Moncton, we are policed by the Rcmp. They're in the process of building a brand new downtown police station for them. They've outgrown the old one. It polices the communities all around us too, not just Moncton, but Riverview and Dieppe, and some of the other areas around too. So many local cities here in the Maritimes don't have their own police force. The Rcmp are our police force. So that was the long way of saying Canada Post issued a new stamp for 150 years. So happy anniversary to the Rcmp. Happy anniversary to friends of mine who are members of the Rcmp and the service that they do. It's very well appreciated, especially here in Moncton, where we had a tragedy a few years ago when 3 of our officers were slain in the line of duty. We have a memorial in downtown Moncton to that. And last weekend when Princess Anne was in town, she laid a wreath there. So there's a history with the Rcmp in Moncton, and we're proud to have them around, and all the service they do and the good they do for our community. So thank you very much, and have a magical week. What, Polo? You say like, subscribe, share, and tell all your friends.
Who's a good boy? Who's a good boy?
Bye.